since I think it was season one of The Office, Michael Scott has racial diversity training, and it just through the humor of The Office destroys that idea. Like it's so silly, but it's as if corporations saw that episode and said, "I think Michael Scott's onto something. Let's try this out." They got the wrong message.
Well, welcome back to Civically Minded, where I give you practical theology for everyday life. As always, I'm your host, Corey Wing. Did you know that all my interview segments, just like this one here, are now being added to my audio podcast on Apple and Spotify? Simply search for Civically Minded and enjoy solid Christian content with your long commutes while you're at work or maybe the gym or wherever you prefer to listen to podcasts. And be sure to tell a friend how they too can enjoy Civically Minded. Well, my guest today is a public intellectual, internationally known scholar, professor, theologian, pastor, a Gracie Jiu-Jitsu instructor, and a father of four. At Arizona State University, he specializes in the philosophy of religion, natural theology, ethics, and the intersection of religion and public life. With a PhD in philosophy and dual master's degrees in philosophy and religious studies, he has authored numerous influential works, including The 12 Arguments, as well as God and the Declaration of Independence. His research examines the clarity of God's existence, ethics, and the philosophical foundations of religious belief. A frequent speaker at renowned institutions like Princeton University, where he's a James Madison Fellow, and Oxford, Dr. Anderson is known for his ability to address complex theological and philosophical topics in an accessible and engaging manner. Beyond academia, Dr. Anderson contributes to Christian education and outreach through the General Revelation Institute, where he organizes conferences and publishes on the significance of general revelation. Incredibly, he's also a pastor of Historic Christian Church in Phoenix, in Peoria, Arizona. I'm excited to welcome to Civically Minded, Dr. Owen Anderson. Thank you, sir.
I'm excited to be here. Thanks for having me, Corey.
Oh, it's absolutely my pleasure. I have to say, right here at the outset, I'm impressed by how much you get accomplished and how you find the time to lecture and teach at the highest level, to pastor a local church, to be a husband and a father of four children, write books, practice and instruct jiu-jitsu, and still find time for interviews like these. So it's rather extraordinary, sir.
Well, thank you. I mean, the things you read are over, 25 years time. So, but you're right. I'm currently doing things like pastoring and being a professor and raising my kids and being a husband. So those do take time. I mean, you've got to keep a well-ordered schedule to do that kind of stuff.
Now, obviously, the scripture tells us that self-discipline is, of course, one of the fruit of the Spirit.
Yeah.
And as such, it's something that is grown and improved upon in the life of all believers, right? I mean, But I'm also on pastoral staff at a church, and I think we would both agree that particular fruit of the Spirit is not being grown in all Christians equally at the same time, right? Maybe including ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And so I have to ask, is the spiritual discipline of self-discipline, which you also find, of course, in non-believers, is that something that you found maybe the martial arts or jiu-jitsu in general has been helpful with?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think probably any sport, but martial arts especially tend to emphasize certain kinds of personal virtues and discipline, which is why a lot of times you'll find they're connected with Eastern or New Age philosophies of living. And so they want to live, say, a clean life and have, respectability and courage, different virtues. But I think the Christian can benefit from a lot of them for those reasons. I know that there's some debate on the manosphere over young men needing good role models.
Yeah.
And so it comes up, should they look to Andrew Tate? Does he have like some good secular role models or some good secular virtues they can imitate? And when you find Christians saying this, I'm a little bit disturbed just because there's so many Christian examples, but there are also unbelievers or secular examples. And one that comes to my mind is Jocko, who has all kinds of great, podcasts and references about things like you just mentioned, self-discipline, without some of the awful excesses of an Andrew Tate. But I also do think Jocko's surrounded by some good Christian guys in his company. So some of I think one of them recently said that he has become a Christian. I don't know if that's true or not, but that'd be great.
Well, praise the Lord if so. I think of Jordan Peterson as another one, a little bit older, a little bit, more fatherly or even
Yeah. Yeah.
grandfatherly,
Right.
depending on the guys that are listening, right? And I think moralistic. I don't think Christian, even though he's
Yeah.
put out some
Mhm.
somewhat cringeworthy biblical material, trying
Yeah.
to. I always find it fascinating when non-believers try to wax poetical on the things of Scripture,
Yeah.
because you can tell they don't really
Fully get it. Yeah.
understand what they're reading.
Well,
It's
I think he got some notoriety for it because we're coming out of an age where the Christians were combating the new atheists, and the
yeah,
new atheists were new compared to the previous group of atheists who were called the friendly atheists. So you had about 30 years where you have these kind of angry atheists who are saying all religion is corruption and the Bible is a bunch of lies. So here comes Jordan Peterson. Now, if you knew about Jungian psychology, you would know what he's going to say, but many Christians didn't know about that. And so he comes out and he says positive things about Jesus. And, he's talking about Jesus having been raised from the dead. And so Christians are just thinking, wow, this is great. And a respectable intellectual from the world's perspective is not bashing us the way Richard Dawkins did. But because of that, I think it's more subtle. Jungian psychology says that, all of these stories in the Bible are allegories for evolutionary stories that are put into us over thousands of years of our development. And so one illustration I thought was really good was when he did have a conversation with Richard Dawkins about a year ago, and I think it occurred here in Arizona because outside the window there were saguaros, and those are unique to our area. And Richard Dawkins said, "Was Cain real?" And Jordan Peterson said, "Yes." He said, "So there was a guy named Cain in history." And Jordan Peterson said, "Doesn't matter. But I thought you just said he's real. He is real." What are you talking about? Richard Dawkins is getting visibly frustrated, and I think Alex O'Connor was moderating it, so he kind of understands why Richard Dawkins is getting frustrated. He's trying to also help Jordan Peterson. Like, you don't really think there was a historical figure, and Jordan Peterson just doubles down and says he's more real than history. And what he means is these archetypes in our mind
yeah,
that evolution gave us. And so, yeah, I think you're right that a lot of Christians say, hey, this is really good. And he does have some good advice, like his rules for living. Number one, I think, was clean your room, right? Just
yeah, yeah.
take care of your stuff. Like, that should be
Make
obvious,
your
but
bed. Yeah,
we
make your
need
bed.
that stuff in our life. So those are great. But then you're right. Once he gets to the Bible, people kind of were cringing, like, oh no.
Well, it's an amazing thing is, and we'll get to this a little bit later because you talk a lot about natural law, and I definitely want to dig into that. But when you get into the kind of Platonic or Aristotelian,
Mhm.
um, more ancient thought, which again has oddly enough been kind of refound and rediscovered. I mean,
Yeah.
it's never really went away, of course,
Yeah.
but there's this kind of rediscovery of it in the modern zeitgeist a little bit, and even in Christian circles, that's really been married to, hey, this is valuable. And while I agree wholeheartedly, I recently had Joe Rigney on my
Oh yeah.
podcast, and I said to Dr. Rigney that I greatly appreciated his very careful approach,
Hmm.
because I think, and I'm not trying to bash anybody here, but when I read Dr. Stephen Wolf's book, my one complaint, and that's
Yeah.
again, it's a huge tome of a book. It's a large book,
Yep.
and to say I have one complaint with it,
Yeah.
and
Not bad.
it is not that bad, right? So I mean, my one complaint was I felt he took a few too many liberties, a few too many. Um, he gave people too much credit. Maybe that's the
Mhm.
best way to say it. Where, oh, I think they know where I'm coming from. And in my
Mhm. Yeah, they
experience,
won't.
the keep it simple stupid became a thing because no, they don't know where you're coming
Mhm.
from. So if you don't tie natural law or Aristotelianism or any of that kind of thing back to scripture, then you're doing your audience, at least as a Christian, you're
Yeah.
doing your audience a disservice because they're not going to make those connections if you don't help them make those
Right. Yeah.
connections.
Yep.
And as two
100%.
pastors, I
Mhm.
think we understand that, a sermon is not a sermon unless you do application, right? I
Yeah.
mean, so
Mhm.
so what changes from a lecture to a sermon is I'm going to help you
Mhm.
apply the word of God, not
Yeah.
just teach you a bunch of facts about the word of God.
Yeah, exactly. And making those connections for people because we, as pastors, we might tend to preach to ourselves, meaning I understand what I'm saying here, rather than preaching to our congregation who doesn't have a PhD in philosophy. They may be skilled at many things, but I got to remember, that what their understanding is and how they'll hear what the sermon is about. And I think when I think about those philosophers, let's take Plato first. I mentioned three things to Christians because you're right. There's been a resurgence of it's called retrieval, retrieving Plato, Aristotle, Aquinas by the Reformed, and I look at that in a couple ways that I think there's some good things and some bad things. The good thing is it's in response to problems in evangelical philosophy. So the evangelicals out of places like Biola have done a really good job the last 30 years of pushing out Christian philosophers. And if there are Christian philosophers in the academy, it's very probable that they came from Biola or Talbot, and then maybe went from there to a PhD in Notre Dame or somewhere. So I'm one of the exceptions, and I'm actually one of the only tenured philosophers at a state school who's a Christian, let alone Reformed. So most
Wow.
of the Christians you'll find go into Christian schools, Christian universities, and so the retrieval by Reformed intellectuals is a good thing because it's pointing out some things like the evangelicals are all persuaded by Molinism, which is the Jesuit view, against the Reform view, and so that's a problem. And then they're also dabbling into the idea that God changes. William Lane Craig says something like that, and so Aquinas gives us this more classical theism. So those are good things. But I also want to remind people that these are systems. Plato is not just a bowl of spaghetti and you take out different noodles that you want. It's a system ordered like more like a building with different floors resting on the previous floor, all on a foundation. And the Roman intellectuals like Julian the Apostate understood that if they want to combat Christianity, they've got to replace it with something intellectual, not just the popular religion of the people. And so what did he look to? Platonism. He perfectly well understood Plato and Christianity are not compatible.
Yeah.
And so when you get into the fundamentals of Plato, this is not like a pre-Christian preparation for the gospel. This is a complete rejection of the gospel or the belief in God, the creator that we find in the Old Testament, and let alone teaching that we reincarnate, that we continue to do so until we become divine ourselves. And so I warn the young Christian, the first step is you should know what Plato says. So study Plato. The second point is, yes, you're going to find some insights in there. But second, think in a systematic way. Understand the insights are ordered around a foundation, which is anti-biblical religion. Plato himself says he went to the Egyptian priests to get his insights. So in one way, you could say Plato is like the philosophical expression of the Egyptian religion, which at one point directly opposed Moses.
Exactly. Yeah. Not talking Coptic Egyptians.
No. Yeah, this is the mystic
pagan
priest.
Egyptians. Yeah.
Yeah, the Greeks the Egyptians did fantastic things like build the pyramids. The Greeks, what they built wasn't as impressive. Some of it's still around, but if you compare the Parthenon to a pyramid, it's nice, but it's not like a pyramid. But the Egyptians, at least what remains, didn't give us any analytic expression of how they did it. Maybe they had it and it got lost, but it seems the Greeks even thought that themselves, that they did these things, but we want to figure out how they did it. So the Greek contribution was that analytic explanation of the Egyptian religion, which I think is what you'll find in Plato. For example, in works like the Timaeus, where he's going over the afterlife. This is just the Egyptian Book of the Dead put into Greek terms. Or in the Republic, at the end of the Republic, he has this myth of who's a man who says he died and came back from the dead and tells us what happens. And it overlaps a lot with one of the stories that Zoroaster told. And so it's probably just from Babylonian religion. So it's like the Greeks are looking to Egypt, looking to Babylon, and right here in the middle, guys, is Jerusalem. And they know it's not as if it was secret. Everyone knew the temple in Jerusalem was magnificent. They knew about the Jewish revelation, but it's just ignored.
Well, and you see that even in scripture when like the Queen of Sheba would come and visit Solomon and say, even your slaves are happy. So the pagan peoples of of the ancient world certainly understood and certainly knew, what was going on there in Jerusalem.
Mhm.
But because of the enmity between man and God, that goes all the way back to, of course, Genesis 3. There's this innate pushback, right, of lost man to go, yeah, but I reject that, because if I accept that, whether it's Richard Dawkins or I'm here in North Carolina, so of course over at UNC, the head of the religion department there,
Another one of them, Bart Ehrman, another one new atheist.
That's right, is Bart Ehrman, who grew up in the church, and certainly apostatized from any kind of personal belief.
Mhm.
And so there's this this fundamental pushback, and so I just find that incredibly amazing that we would point to those types of thinkers and say, "Hey, look here," especially for young believers.
Mhm.
Again, you said kind of this masculine return, and that's true. I've seen it too. Whether if you spend a day on X,
Yeah.
you can't help but be bombarded by the Anon army who is all into this stuff. And I'm
Mhm.
not saying that those young men that are part of that don't have some legitimate gripes.
Yeah.
They do. Western American, especially philosophical and cultural thought of the last
Yep.
40, 50, 60 years, which most of them aren't even that old, obviously,
Yep.
but certainly their entire lives has failed them.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're 30 or under, especially if you're white and Christian,
Mhm.
you've been told that you're the cause of all things that are wrong in the world,
Yep.
literally your entire life. So I get why they're mad. I do
Yeah.
understand that, but we need to be very careful as Christians, especially a little bit older, maybe in leadership, to point them in directions that are actually going to be beneficial and helpful,
Yeah.
and not lead them to just enough truth to be dangerous.
Yeah.
So
Well,
I want to
that's
go ahead.
well, I was just gonna give an example of that because my college at ASU boasts on its webpage that it is 70% female enrollment. And then it also claims that that's the vulnerable group that they still want to keep helping, meaning they intend to increase that. And there's no mention of what do we do to reach the men and
Yeah.
why aren't they enrolling in college? And I don't think that's unique. That number might be higher than most, but I don't think that's unique in the universities across our country, which is that men aren't going. And one of the reasons you mentioned is young men, why would you pay $60,000 to be told you're the intersectionality hub of everything wrong in the world? And the answer is they won't. You can get a good job without going to college. That myth has been busted. And so I think it's incumbent though on us, especially in those of us who are in pastoral roles, to think what are these young men hearing about themselves? What's the truth? And how do we equip them to become mature Christians? Because one response is to say DEI is racist. So I'm going to make my own DEI about my own identity group. And that's just allowing the unbeliever to set the battle and to set where we fight instead of saying, no, I'm not going to fight on identity turf. It's
Yeah.
always wrong to divide us up that way. We need to call it out when it happens, but then bring them back to the Christian field where we're going to have the conflict against unbelief on Christian terms.
That's incredibly helpful. I want to backtrack just a little bit because I think it does tie into kind of the greater topic that we just touched on. You're obviously not just have you practiced jujitsu and the martial arts
Mhm.
for many years, you actually are a Gracie jujitsu instructor.
Mhm.
So, would you include, and I'm intentionally asking
Mhm.
this because of things that I've been seeing more and more of recently, would you include that the martial arts are something that all men should pursue, or is it something that all people should pursue?
Yeah, that's a good question. There was actually a little bit of a Twitter spat maybe a year ago where someone said, I think Jocko posted a picture of his daughter winning a tournament in jujitsu, and then someone posted, Christian in the manosphere posted, "This is bad. You can't have women in jujitsu." So let me take it at two steps. One is all men. I mean, I wouldn't want to make a recommendation in the sense of like there's a lot of particularities, different people's situations.
Yeah.
Overall, it's good to learn a sport of some kind that teaches you abilities with your body, so you're not, you have dexterity and agility. You're not just clumsy, and it's good for us to exercise. We know that
Mhm.
even from Paul even says that is healthy for you. So then, specifically a martial art, well, it is good. I mean, the truth of the matter is, if people are a guy thinks to himself, "I'll just get a gun," that's probably not a successful solution to the kinds of conflicts you might run into, and then there's still a small percentage that you'll happen to you. You could get through life and never be assaulted, but if you're assaulted, jujitsu will be a much better tool than a gun initially. Because the second you pull a gun out, it's now on the scene. And the bad guy can say, well, I thank you very much. Right. And now it's in their side. And so I'm not against guns, but I'm just saying that the first idea that's the first thing I'll do. Um, Even if you do end up successfully using it, you are going to court. And even if you are found innocent for self defense, that's 4 years later, tens of thousands of dollars of lawyers, your life is turned upside down. So what we offer in our program for beginners is called Combatives Program, which the Gracies developed. And just for everyone listening, the Gracies is the family that brought jiu-jitsu from Brazil. And Brazilian jiu-jitsu is basically Japanese jiu-jitsu for street fighting. And so the Gracies developed over a few decades, watching how street fights unfold. What are the common ways that you'll be assaulted? And then what are the best ways to respond to that with the idea of keeping everyone safe? So, for example, in a striking art, the response might be to do as much damage to the other guy as you possibly can. Okay, but then you're in that same court track. You're going to court. You might be found innocent, but he's permanently blind, and you got all his money that you got to spend on it. So the Gracie's question was, how do we get everyone out of this safely with jujitsu? So I like that philosophy. I do think that translates for men and women, not just men. What the Gracies did, they have a specific program just for women as well, Women Empowered, which is about the ways that women are assaulted, because women are not assaulted the same way you and I will be assaulted.
That's right.
And it also escalates very quickly for women. So in other words, you and I might be assaulted for pride. We offended some guy on accident, or they want something like our watch or our credit cards. But for a woman, we know what the person's assaulted them for. And so they have to kidnap the woman and take them somewhere else. And then very likely the highest percentage is you'll be dead at the end of that. So the Gracie program for women is about how to survive that kind of assault, which I think, yes, women need to know that. If it gives them confidence, because when you talk to women, they'll say something that men never think about. They'll say, I have to think about getting raped when I go out.
Yeah.
Men aren't, that's on our mind, right? But a woman goes out by herself, there's a good chance that she's thinking, she's kind of scanning the room, wondering about that. And so if you can provide your wife, your daughters, your sister with that kind of confidence to know, okay, even if I'm pretty confident in my ability to survive that and be safe. Well, that's a great thing.
Yeah. Yeah, as a guy that's got a wife and 2 daughters, yeah, I mean, that and knowing that I can't be with them
Yeah.
24 hours a day, 7 days a
Yeah.
week, of course. So
Well,
so
and
yeah,
the guys responded like to Jocko and said, "Well, just you have a little gun in her purse." Well, that's even more what I just said with a woman, because she pulls that out, and again, it's up close. The guy's right there. He'll just say, "Well, thank you. Now do what I say."
yeah,
Compared to a guy who might have a stronger wrist or something, so you're more confident. You'll keep the grip on the gun. As soon as you introduce a weapon to the fight, it could become the other person's weapon or used against you somehow. Even if you retain control of it, it could be used against you. So that's not like a silver bullet to solving every female assault. But then the question might be, well, okay, self-defense is one thing. What about sportive jujitsu? And I also don't think that's a problem myself. I wouldn't tell someone you have to do it.
right.
But I think if someone says, I'm really interested in doing that, that's within Christian liberty to do it.
Yeah. Well, and I bring that up somewhat because I know that it's been a little bit of a hot topic, in the minds of, again, that manosphere, right? So
Mhm.
I'm glad that you jumped on that, because there is this weird kind of contingent, right, of quote based patriarchal
Mhm.
Christianity. And I would say that, and if my wife were sitting here with me, she would say
Mhm.
our home is basically a patriarchy. I mean, I run the
Mhm.
show,
Sure.
and it's not the old well, he's the head, but I'm the neck,
Yeah.
wink, wink. She doesn't play
Yeah.
those games, and God love her for it. But there's this weird subsect of that world, right? That would wholeheartedly disagree with you
Mhm.
that wives, daughters, no females of any kind should participate in the activity. And I tend to kind of lean towards what you're saying of, yes, but you're not with them all the time.
Mhm.
I mean, even if you work from home, which is certainly more common these days than not. I mean, they
Yeah.
go to the grocery store. I mean, there's
Yep.
times when you're just not with them. So I appreciate your kind of clear thinking on that. And what I find is a bigger problem, because again, we can have those kind of secondary, tertiary, disagreements, even within the church,
Mhm.
even within the faith. So I mean, okay, fine, we don't see eye to eye on that.
Yeah.
But my bigger problem with that is that kind of categorical appropriation,
Mhm.
for lack of a better word, seems to be at home more in the world of like DEI cultural warriors than
Yeah.
in the church. But I'm
Yeah.
hearing more and more people in the church, and again, especially young men of a certain type of bend, who
Mhm.
are leaning in that direction. So it makes me think about this term that I've heard about, and certainly some of my viewers have heard about, called the woke right,
Yeah.
and you kind of think, ah, the woke right,
Yeah.
and you've increasingly heard that terminology. Could you, Dr. Anderson, could you tell us what is the woke right? How should we interact with this? Whether it's fabled woke right, or maybe there
Yeah.
really is something called the woke right.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if it's okay, let me wrap up one last thing about jujitsu is
Please, yes.
perhaps some aspects of jujitsu could appear to some people sexual or ability to be sexualized, like pulling guard.
Yeah.
And that happens both like I have atheist colleagues who insult me or just jujitsu in general. They say it's latent homosexuality because you're rolling around the ground in what looks like pajamas with other men. And so I think the worry translates then to women. Do I really want my wife or my daughter in those kinds of positions? But I mean, one response is women are never made to roll with men. You
Yeah.
can have just female classes. But then at the same time, if you want to train them to fight against a man, I remember talking to one student and she had done very well with just women. But then the one time she kind of simulated an assault with the male instructor, she said, I couldn't believe the strength difference. Like it's
Mm,
just different in kind. And I realized I cannot muscle my way out of a man attacking me. So
yeah.
it's good knowledge to have. But then I also though respond like to my critics that try to poke fun at me as they're atheists. They're trying to insult me as a Christian. Well, you're the one turning it that way, right? It just shows that that's what's on your mind all the time. No one in there is thinking about that at all. And so not everything needs to be sexualized. We don't want to adopt that attitude from the world. Most things, in fact, aren't sexual. They're completely non-sexual. So that's a little more defense of it. But the woke right, I would define it this way: to be woke means that you've bought into identity politics and the belief that some identities are kept down by other identities, and then third, the proof of that is outcomes.
Mm,
So and Trump just outlawed this just last week, using outcomes to prove disparity. So the argument is if you have two groups and one of them produces more neurosurgeons than the other, that's due to structural racism. Now, anyone who's trained in sociology and doing statistics knows that's not necessarily true. That might be true, but there's other explanations. And that's one thing that Jordan Peterson's famous for is the simple explanation called free will. Not everyone wants the same jobs, and different cultures have different values that produce different job outcomes freely chosen, not forced on them by anybody. So he especially looks at that with men and women, that men are more willing to freely choose physically draining jobs outside, and women generally freely choose office work, and those just pay differently. So I got a guy I know who just went out to work on the oil fields, and it's going to be like 12-hour days hauling these huge pipes, very physically draining, and it's going to be all men. So Jordan Peterson says that's not sexism, that's just free will. So I think that's those three things can be applied to the right, and we see some of that on the right. Now I know there's guys who would say it gets applied to me like Stephen Wolf, and it's not true. So I'm not looking at any names right now, but just to say yes, I do see guys who just flip the script and they say this. Well, we're doing white intersectionality now, and we need to promote being white. And I think that's again letting the enemy determine where you're going to fight, and it's a losing battle on that front. Christianity would lose if we pick that as our fight, because at the end of the day, you have to abandon so much about Christianity in order to maintain that. At least that's why. I mean, some of them might say, "No, you don't. This is real Christianity," and I just don't think you'll find that in the Bible.
yeah. No, I find that to be incredibly insightful because it's there's so many people, and again, whether in my audience that'll watch this or just in our churches, right, who
Mhm.
don't interact with 20 somethings.
Mhm.
If you don't have kids at home or
Yeah.
your grandkids are 4 and 5, or maybe they're already grown and what have you, you really don't once you hit a certain age. I'm 47 years old. So
Mhm.
I had kids later in life. I've got 3 small children.
Oh, okay.
But most guys my age have college
Yeah.
age kids. So a
Mhm.
lot of our friends have kids in around that age bracket. And of course I do this. So I'm
Yeah.
I'm in the online space and social media space. But if you're not, then you have limited exposure. And so you don't really know what is kind of happening in that little
Yeah.
subtext or subculture of the world. And so for those of us that see it, we go, no, this is really becoming a thing. The Corey Mollers and
Yeah. Well, I
and
was going to mention this debate coming up.
That's right, with James White. That's right.
Mhm.
Which I am hoping and praying that Dr. White just shellacks him, because I've said to some of the young men in my world, Corey Mahler has nothing for you.
Yeah. No.
He's a heretic. And I think this is a failure of ecclesiology,
Mhm.
as far as theologically speaking, where we haven't practiced church discipline well. Actually, his church did practice church discipline and excommunicated him, but because the rest of us in the greater, large C church,
Mhm.
have kind of had a failure of
Yeah.
ecclesiology and training, we don't really understand biblically what that means.
Yeah.
So we think, well, we can still parlay with a guy. No, you cannot.
Yeah.
No, he's been excommunicated from the Church of God. So
Mhm.
we are to treat him like a pagan or a tax collector,
Yeah.
so that, say, if he is saved, if he truly is one of the elect of Christ, so that he will be so buffeted by
Right.
Satan that he will return to the faith. If he doesn't return, then, like John says in First John, they went out from us because they were not of us.
Yep.
And that's the telltale sign that Mr. Mahler, or anyone for that
Yeah.
matter, is a non-believer. Hey there, civically minded family. It's me, Corey. I'm sitting on my front porch after a long day, listening to the sounds of nature and enjoying a premium cigar from 1689cigars.com. I got to tell you, I've tried everything from the cheap stuff all the way up to the Cubans, and 1689 makes some of the finest premium cigars I've ever had. Go on over and tell Chance and the guys that Civically Minded sent you, and be on the lookout in the next few weeks for your own Civically Minded branded cigar. Let me know what you think.
Well,
But
and in our culture, part of the woke left is to assume the perpetrator is innocent and was mistreated by the authorities.
Mhm.
And so that can happen. I mean, I see it happen to Christians all the time. You mentioned Joe Rigney. He just did a book on this, the abuse of empathy and logic. We call it appeal to pity. It's a logical fallacy, which basically abuses the other person's disposition to compassion.
Yeah.
And so in our movies, our TV shows, the initial bad guy turns out to have just been mistreated when he's young, and therefore he had to do some bad things when he's older. And so the same thing in church discipline is why I bring it up. People will say, "Well, he was excommunicated," but I got to look into it myself. I bet those elders were like mean and not listening to him. Instead of saying the opposite, okay, I mean, it's none of my business. I don't need to look into it. They did due process. This is the conclusion they came
That's right.
to. And so we're so trained to distrust any kind of authority structure that we have this attitude, and some of it's good. Part of that's what makes us Americans, right? We disagree with our government. We're free to do so. We can write essays against the government, not end up in prison. So some of that's good, but then it can also become a weakness, and that's often a strategy of the devil is to take what is a strength and encourage you to do it even more. So now it becomes a weakness.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
No.
I think the debate with James White is good. A couple reform guys I posted positively about it, and a couple reform guys who don't agree with Corey, but they just kind of look down on these kinds of debates as more like entertainment, poo-pooed it. But I think especially in this case is important because of the public spectacle that will come out of it. Like you said, I even believe he already won just by having Corey agree to that thesis.
Mhm.
It's such a heinous thesis that case closed, right? But I've noticed on X even just today, James White's posting a bunch of quotes from Corey getting ready for the debate, and so yeah, I'm assuming it'll be standard James White style, and he will bring it to this case, which is a very clear case, I think. And so I think it'll be good as a public witness going forward for a young man who say, well, what about this? Hey, watch this debate, and then let's talk.
Well, and what you kind of said without saying it really bleeds into another kind of logical fallacy, what's called confirmation bias, right? So
Mhm.
so we end up having this incredible confirmation bias that we've already come to whatever that is, whatever the debate is, whatever the
Oh
argument
yeah,
is, with our own kind of preloaded, predisposed ideas about something. And
yep,
all we're really looking for is someone to go, well, you're already right, because we
yeah.
always think
That's
we're
what
the
happens.
smartest guy in the room,
Mhm.
right? So I mean,
Most of these debates are like that, and that's one reason I'm not. In one way, I'm not a huge fan of them, and
yeah.
I haven't done a lot of them because of that reason. I think what James White has done is got a lot of things on the record, which can be good. Like I've gone back and looked at his debates on King James only, just to get input from both sides about what is this even about? What are the issues involved? So I think that what he's done has been good. And someone like William Lane Craig, has essentially exposed atheist after atheist after atheist that they don't know what they're talking about. And what blows my mind about that is William Lane Craig has the same 5 points for 30 years.
Yeah.
And in other words, you're going into a fight and you know 100% what he's going to say, and
He's
they
going to throw
cannot
the
figure
left
out how to
jab, the
respond
right
to it.
hook, yeah.
Yep.
And you know in what order he's going to throw them, and you still
Yep.
got hit. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's got to the point now where Richard Dawkins has refused to debate him. They set up a debate in Oxford a few years ago, and at the last minute, like 2 hours before it, Richard Dawkins pulls out because he knows he will be exposed. And so I think for that reason, those kinds of debates are good. But otherwise, yeah, I think you go in with confirmation bias. And so the audience itself may not change their mind, but you got a lot of other people watching down the road who are curious. Like I said, like if I'm looking into King James only debates, I'm curious. I want to know what are the issues. You can get a lot of guys like that are not necessarily haven't made up their mind. But one of the things, I argue, being in the secular academy, I'm around DEI. I currently have a lawsuit against ASU because they were requiring DEI training, which taught about the evils of whiteness. And so that's where they broke the law. Employers can require you to take training. They can't get involved in race blame. But at the same time, the truth is that Christianity is the truly, so to speak, global or international institution. And I think we see this throughout church history that unbelief always tries to counterfeit belief.
Mhm.
And so it's Christianity, the Bible over and over, New Testament, Old Testament, the nations come in to worship God. All nations are discipled. Christianity is really the only institution that has that. Governments aren't meant to be global. They're local, they have boundaries. But the church doesn't. And so to then adopt the world's perspective and say we're identifying the church with Western civilization and we have to defend Christendom as Western civilization, you're already missing the point about the nations. It isn't that Western civilization westernizes the nations and then they become Christian. It's that the nations come to worship the Lord. And the Great Commission, go into all nations, discipling them. So I think we need to make sure we don't lose that because we see a gross form of it in something like DEI and the radical leftist Marxist globalism. We don't want to say, yeah, globalism is bad. Well, no, it's not. That's a counterfeit version. Let's look at the Christian version.
That's again the way that you're kind of walking us through these. I'm finding extremely helpful. So, is it fair to say that maybe that's why upholding conservative values in a liberal university setting like yourself, or say even in corporate America, a lot of folks obviously that watch this are not university professors, but a
Mhm.
lot of them do work for large corporate companies or
Yeah.
something that have these HR departments or these
Mhm.
DEI, requirements or what have you. Here in my area, Lowe's is
Mhm. Oh,
is
okay.
headquartered here, and there's other major corporations. Bank of America is out of Charlotte.
Mhm.
So the Charlotte Metroplex has really become a hub for some huge companies.
Yeah.
So why is it so important that as Christians we stand up to this kind of group think
Mhm.
and push back against it? Because is it true that that actually is the opposite of promoting
Yeah.
diversity of thought?
Well, exactly. I think for corporations, it's been almost 25 years since I think it was season one of The Office. Michael Scott has racial diversity training, and it just through the humor of The Office destroys that idea. Like it's so silly, but it's as if corporations saw that episode and said, "I think Michael Scott's onto something. Let's try this out." They got the wrong message because what an HR department needs to do is it's going to have to handle employee disputes. So it makes sense to me that you might have some training about how to avoid disputes and how to solve them when you get in them, especially in a workplace with lots of different people, lots of backgrounds. We don't work there because we agree on our philosophy or religion. We work there because we want this job at this corporation. So those kinds of training makes sense. You're going to have to do something like that. And there's also a legal side that when an employee dispute boils over to court, the company can say, "Yeah, I know, but we gave them this training."
Yeah.
So that makes sense. But the philosophy you adopt can't make it worse. In other words, the Matt Walsh movie recently, "Am I Racist?" and he pretended like he was teaching a class. And one of the things he said to the group was, "Now we're all going to point at the most racist person in the room, right? And you're supposed to look around and point probably at the white male, right?" And the humor of that was that's what those classes are doing. How could you possibly think that's going to make group cohesion when it's simply a grievance and blame setting? And so the HR departments, if anybody's listening from a CEO perspective, pick one that actually builds teams, that makes people like each other and want to see each other at work and cooperate, not one that divides them into groups and then tries to make them blame each other.
So let me shift gears just a little bit. Um, Take this more in kind of a civic realm instead of, say, corporate.
Mhm.
Would you be in favor of something? And again, I'm not trying to put words in your mouth. A
Mhm.
legitimate question of something that would resemble more of a, like, say, theonomic Christian state, or is that merely a ditch on the other side of the road? You know,
Yeah.
where now, yes, could you
Well,
expound on that?
because one of my areas is the First Amendment. And I just held a seminar last week at ASU on the First Amendment titled, What is it and why do we need it? And it was very good timing because over Easter, the White House webpage, the official White House webpage, posted that Jesus is the Son of
Mhm.
God who died for sins and rose from the dead.
Yeah, put a Bible verse up and said
Yeah,
he is
that's
risen.
not just
Yeah,
the
yeah.
president saying, I believe these things, which many people would still be uncomfortable with. It's the official government White House webpage. So part of my seminar at the end was let's debate that. We went through Supreme Court decisions, original intent and meaning, and then how the Supreme Court's interpreted, and then we debated that. And there's basically three views about this. And I'll tell you what they are, then I'll tell you mine. The first view is the one we've been living under, which is I would call it the atheist view. The First Amendment is anti-religion, and any hint of religion violates the First Amendment. And that view has been ruling for some time, and it'll come out in these kind of expressions. Okay, if you have the Ten Commandments next to a courthouse, you also have to have a statue of Baphomet to be equal. So it
Mhm.
has this idea of multiculturalism when you could say, but 98% of the people in the community, Jews, Protestants, Roman Catholics, Eastern Orthodox, agree with the Ten, and Muslims agree with the Ten Commandments. 0.002% worship Baphomet. So just as a public, shouldn't we be able to have things we believe in together and not revert to multiculturalism right away? I think so. So the second one is the supposed neutral one. Government just doesn't say anything one way or the other. It's not necessarily anti-religion, but it doesn't say anything either.
It's kind of that
And I think that one
principled
just,
pluralism, right? I
yeah, I
mean,
think that just turns into the first one.
yeah.
Because what you're in other words, what you're teaching is you can have a successful life without Christ. And that's what our secular universities teach. They would say they're in that second one. And I would say, well, no, you're teaching your students they can become wise and lead good lives, and they don't need God or Christ or the Bible. That's a position you've taken. And there's a lot of things in life like that neutrality, there's no third option. You're either this side or you're this side. That's the only options. And if you say neither, then you're on this side. And so the second one and the third one just become the same thing, even though initially in people's minds they're different. So the first one says, which I think is what the original intent was, um, you don't have to go to church. The government's not going to say there's a Church of America and you better be in the pew on Sunday or you're going to prison. But the government can also say all kinds of true things about religion. And that's what the White House did. The government can say Jesus is the Son of God. Our country is based on Christian beliefs about who God is, the nature of God. It's not just God, and then you could fill in pantheism. No, it's theism, God the Creator, and we get rights from Him, not just from evolution. And so I think the first one is consistent with the intention, and most of the Supreme Court decisions until after World War II. Then you start to get into the Supreme Court really doing the second or the first and second ones, which was atheism or neutrality. But I'm for the first one. I don't think the White House violated the First Amendment. No one has to go to church because the government said Jesus is the Son of God. And so, Presbyterian, dissenter, yeah, I don't want the government saying you got to use the Book of Common Prayer or you're going to prison. But at the same time, the government can and should say true things about the Bible. So the last objection to that, though, is from the multiculturalists is sure, you like it now and it's your religion, but the next president's a Hindu and he puts up the Bhagavad Gita is true and you are God, just you have to be enlightened, then you'll object to it. And I would say, well, of course, I don't believe those things are true, but I don't think the way to avoid that is to say no Christian can ever say true things. We can't say the government was built on Christian beliefs because that's a lie. It was built on those things. If we get a president like that, they're the one who's saying false things now. And the way to do that is to expose it through public debate. So great, let's bring the beliefs of the Bhagavad Gita out. It's pantheistic. It teaches that you're a god, but you're confused. And because of that, you got to reincarnate until you realize this. Let's debate those and show why they're false. That president would be doing us a favor in a sort of he didn't maybe not intending it, doing us a favor because that now becomes a national debate that we have to go over. And then the second objection I always hear is, yeah, but again, like you just mentioned, you're Presbyterian, you got a lot of Baptist friends, you guys are always kind of worried about the government because you've been dissenters. Do you really want the government now pushing your views? No, I don't want to. I don't want the government saying you got to go to church or you'll get fined or go to prison. But it is kind of refreshing to me that we might be moving back to where our national debate is over inter-Christian issues and not atheists control it. So, for
Mhm.
example, one of the images the White House put up was a close-up of a crucifix. So I put a message underneath that on X and said, "Hey, I'm really thankful that you're saying true things, but you shouldn't have a crucifix up on Easter because he's risen."
Yeah.
And so that's a good debate to have. I know
Yeah.
Melania is Roman Catholic. Trump's raised in Presbyterian Church. So let's have those debates again. That's great. Versus we're all forced to live under atheism.
Well, and I love that you bring that up because just this past Sunday, biggest thing in the news, of course, for the last week, 10 days, the only news almost honestly covered has been the passing of Pope Francis,
Mhm,
right?
yeah.
And in the Protestant world, I'm in the PCA. So in the
Mhm,
Protestant world, it's so very easy for us to kind of dismiss that as a nothing burger.
mhm,
And I told my adult Sunday school class, I said, guys, you do that to your own foolishness. You look foolish,
mhm,
because I said, what does the lost world view the Pope as?
mhm. Yep.
And they said, well, like the head of Christianity. And I said, you're absolutely right. So understand this is an in-house fight.
Yeah.
As far as they're concerned, like the vicar of Christ just died. Now, you and I could have very serious debates about that.
Mhm.
But I said, guys, before you get too far down the road on this,
Yeah.
and I am Protestant and I have major beef with
Yeah.
a lot of Catholic dogma and doctrine and theology, obviously. But I said, don't miscalculate the significance
Yeah.
of the role in and of itself. Well, I think Francis was a
From the appearance
awful.
of the world. Yep.
That's right, right, and even in just space time, even in just the in reality, I
Mhm.
said because Billy Graham, who would be the closest thing that we would have in the Protestant side, or for us good Presbyterians say R.C. Sproul, even
Yeah.
when those men died, as significant as they were to me personally, or even to our world, the only real people of power that went to those funerals, certainly Billy Graham had a few presidents because he was a personal friend, right? But the president of like Argentina
Mhm.
or the king of Sudan or that they didn't come to those
Yeah.
funerals. Those men, heads of state from all over the world, did just go to the Vatican.
Yeah.
So belittle the station, the office, the man, even as much as you want, but to over a billion Catholics in the world,
Yeah.
there's no one more significant living than this position. And so I said to our people, you really need to do better to kind of think categorically or maybe non-categorically, kind of outside of that, because the lost community sees us all in the same bucket, in the same boat.
Yeah, and
Um,
even like if a ruler died, say I don't know, just picking a nation. You mentioned Argentina. The president of Argentina dies. Some heads of state will go, but not a lot.
yeah,
Whereas here you have many, many heads of state. I mean,
that's
right?
right.
Coming, so it's not just because the Vatican's a state, which it also is, because a tiny little state like that wouldn't get that many other heads of state at the funeral. So you're right. The perspective is this, and for us Presbyterians who know our history, will say, well, this is bad, right? This is what we were dealing with 400 years ago
Yeah.
up to the present. But you're right to say you got to think about the appearance of it from the world's perspective and why that still is. I mean, I had secular colleagues posting who are atheists, they anti-Christian, but they were posting how they really liked Pope Francis. And I was like, yeah, I bet you did. I would have predicted that, right?
Yep.
But it's interesting that they'll take Christianity on those terms. So I think for us Presbyterians is a call to say we got to keep people reminded about what are these doctrines and what did we teach? Because if the statistics are true, over Easter weekend, 30,000 French were baptized into the Catholic Church. And the
Wow.
UK is reporting Roman Catholic resurgence. The US is reporting. And now I see some statistics that say, yeah, but for everyone who comes in, so many people leave. Maybe, I don't know, so maybe we don't know for sure. But my own experience, my anecdotal experience is that, yeah, if you're an intellectual exploring Christianity, it's going to tend to be Roman Catholicism.
Yeah.
And that, for Presbyterians who have always been very heavy on intellectual pursuits, that's a sad thing that we can't attract the intellectuals anymore. Something's happened that we need to address.
No, I would agree with that wholeheartedly as well. That there's considering Princeton, what
Yep.
was the Presbyterian seminary for,
Yep.
a long, long time.
And that's one of my areas of study is Princeton. I published on Hodge and Warfield and try to address that question, what happened? Because as I was doing research there, I'm walking around campus and there's things like there's a rainbow sticker up that says safe place. And they don't mean for Arminians, right? They
Yeah,
mean for
yeah.
LGBTQ plus philosophy. And that really seems to dominate their life now. So you'll have the Hodge building with rainbow stickers on it. And so yeah, something it wasn't just that they became loose in their doctrine, they flipped to advocating an anti-Christian belief, but calling it Christianity. It's not as if they apostatized and said, hey, it turns out Christianity is not right. They're teaching a completely false view as if it's Christianity. So that's a big problem. I prefer it when people are just honest and say, yeah, I'm not a Christian. I'm teaching Freudian sexuality, not biblical Christianity. But because at least you have integrity then. At least you're telling it as it is. But these cases are no, we're installing this woman pastor who's following this lifestyle and calling it this is exactly what Christianity is all about. So yeah, the Presbyterians are in bad shape.
Yeah, I mean, the PCUSA, I think we've all just basically kind of
Yeah.
waved goodbye to and went,
Mhm.
well, they're gone,
I've met one or
and
two guys in there who are sticking it out, and I know they're good believers, but that's their plan and strategy. God bless them. But yeah,
fight from the
otherwise,
inside. Yeah,
mhm,
yeah.
vast majority is yep.
And I know we've only got about less than 10 minutes or real less than that. So I want to kind of finish with this. I want to be respectful of your time, and I
Sure.
appreciate all the time you've given me
It's a
this
lot of
morning.
fun. I hope I can talk with you again.
I would love that. I noticed you've done a lot of articles for Clear Truth Media. I was actually in Toledo last month for their
Oh, good,
2025 conference, Dangerous Friends. I had been invited to come and participate as a
good.
Christian podcaster, kind of in a media role, so me and a couple other
That's
guys
cool.
could kind of chronicle what was happening.
Yep.
And I've got to say, I was really impressed by that organization. I've
Mhm.
got some friends. Rosario Butterfield's a
Yeah.
personal friend, and I got a couple other friends that write for it and things. Um, but I I didn't know much about them other than that, and I was
Yeah.
so impressed by that organization and its lofty goals of kind of becoming
Thank you.
what I've seen you say, or I think these some of your terms, what you call a cultural shaper or a culture
Mhm.
shaper.
Yep.
Um, and kind of the groundswell that I saw there at the Dangerous Friends conference. And there was this kind of connective tissue, albeit probably loose, but connective nonetheless,
Mhm.
with like between Clear Truth Media and like the White Rose Resistance,
Mhm.
even Turning Point USA, who had a
Mhm.
number
They
of
were there. Yeah.
number of representatives there,
Mhm.
and other organizations like that. And it gave me some real hope
Mhm.
that something kind
Yeah.
of truly cohesive and maybe lasting is coming from all of these
Yep.
various Christian efforts that are being made.
Exactly.
And while obviously the formal church is really the offensive hammer that will
Mhm.
blow against the gates of hell, um, what role do you see these kind of
Yeah.
parachurch or other outside groups having? Is it merely to augment and support the life of the church, or can they fulfill kind of a larger role
Yeah.
in something like a cultural movement?
Yeah, I actually just recently heard a great sermon by Martin Lloyd-Jones where he was talking about this, and so I agreed with his view, which is the church, and you shouldn't have any other institutions that try to be the church. However, the church disciples people, and they go out into their professions, out into the world. So in this case, they go out into their profession of media. But for him, he was a medical doctor, so there was Christian medical doctor organizations, and he said those shouldn't try to become evangelistic organizations because you're not going to a medical conference to for that purpose. You're going there to get Christians explain to you the best medicine from their perspective, and they're helping each other. And so I would say that applies here as well with Clear Truth Media. They're doing what needs to be done in the area of media and all of the influence that has on culture as Christians, and so that's great. um, I'm not suggesting they're trying to take over evangelizing for the church, but if that ever happened, then you say, well, now you're blurring the lines. But it's also true then from the church's perspective. The church doesn't become a medical profession. It doesn't become the media hub. It trains up believers who go out with the talents they've been given and transform culture. And so I'm really excited about Clear Truth is a lot of fun. I had a series in there called the Red Tape Letters, which is a spin on the Screw Tape Letters, except for it's written by a Marxist to a university professor, and they're trying to deconvert a young Christian student. So the Marxist Comrade Red Tape, is giving advice to Professor Holloway, and so that was a lot of fun. I had that in there, but I think the question of hope is a great one to end on, because I've gotten that question a few times as I've been involved in politics myself, or involved in public intellectual work. Do you have any hope, though? Is this just kind of a blip? It'll be maybe 10 years of people being more conservative, and then it'll flip again, because what happens is you'll get a movement one way, but then they go too far, so then they go back to the other side, and we're just in this back and forth. And my response, it very well could be, unless Christ is in it. And so my hope is not in cultural movements. My hope is, and my firm belief is, Christ is ruling from the right hand of God and making all nations his footstool, and that will happen. And I don't mean doubt about that. My faith is not like in a cultural uprising. However, if this is because Christians are saying they're essentially repenting with their actions, we've been negligent, we've been caught up in the suburban lifestyle dream, or the go to heaven and get out of this world dream, I'm just a pilgrim passing through, and we've neglected dominion that God gave us to do, then that's great. Then that's going to bear fruit. And I think that's really the way to look at hope. Is it's not that your hope goes up and down. If you understand God's providence, you always have maximal hope, because even when you're at the low point, that means God's teaching you as a loving father and disciplining you. And although that doesn't feel good at the time, you have hope in it because it's done by God. And so I think we've been under divine discipline for a number of decades. And to get out of that will require repenting of the things that God was teaching us. And so I'm kind of on the fence about, am I going to see that or not? But I do lean towards, I see young people speaking. I see Charlie Kirk becoming more and more theological and affirming the role of Christ in all things. And so
Tucker
that's okay,
Carlson,
this might be
another one.
something.
Tucker Carlson becoming more and more Christian.
It's not
yeah.
just culture that's going on here. Maybe we're coming out of, we're repenting through our actions of, we should have been doing this the whole time. We've let the atheists take over. What were we thinking?
Yeah. No, that and really all you echoed, and again, I don't say this pejoratively. I mean this in the brightest accolade. You echo, even though he was a Pharisee and they had their own problems, Gamaliel's scholarly advice out of Acts chapter 5. If this is of God, we would be fighting God. And if it's not of God, it will fizzle, right? So, well, Dr. Anderson, I cannot tell you how much I've enjoyed our conversation, and I've appreciated your insights. Where can my audience, find what you're doing, whether it's at ASU or your church, or where can they find you?
Yeah, so I try to keep my social media, internet stuff consistent with Dr. Owen Anderson. So if you go to my Substack, Dr. Owen Anderson, that's mostly committed to my work in the academy against the woke, liberal, anti-Christian culture. So I report there about some of the things that are going on within ASU, for example. And then I have Twitter is the same, where I do a little more broad cultural analysis. But then if you want my books on theology or philosophy, I have an author page on Amazon, and you can look that up. And I've got some very technical books, academic books. I've got more popular books. I've written some books for homeschoolers so they can learn Christian philosophy in high school. So I'd love to hear from your viewers as well. If you reach out to me on X or Substack, I'll definitely respond.
Excellent. Well, I will be in prayer both for your ministries there at the Historic Christian Church of Phoenix, as well as at Arizona State. Certainly your legal battle, that your protracted now legal battle with Arizona State. I'll be in prayer for that. And just thank you, sir.
Well, thank you. Thank you for what you do, because you're helping get the word out there. It's very important.
Well, I'd love to have you back on sometime and discuss some more, American civic stuff, because I know that's been stuff you've written on. So let's talk offline, and we'll try to reschedule another time for that. Well, my audience, I love you. Thank you for coming along and always joining in what we do. So until next time, I'm your host, Corey Wing. And remember, be brave, be bold, and be civically minded. God bless.